Hi, I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. Almost every country in the world is battling multiple crises as a consequence of the coronavirus outbreak. One of the most devastating of these crises is the soaring unemployment rate across the world. In the United States, more than 30 million jobs have been lost since mid-March. In India, more than 120 million workers lost jobs in April. In Pakistan, estimates show that job losses will hit up to 18 million. These figures are just estimations, and the true devastation is expected to be much deeper. Let's discuss this further. Joining us for this conversation, Ms. Nilufer Narli, who's a professor of political sociology. She joins us from Istanbul. Now, we've been talking about how the impact on the economy will be devastating. It's going to cause massive unemployment, which we're already seeing happening. But when we look at the social fabric and how it's going to be impacted by such deep-rooted financial issues, what do you see happening? What are the major changes people should brace themselves for?
This huge unemployment, it is increasing every day. It can affect the family, the function of family could change, and then it can affect the urban life. We could see a return to country. I will explain it more. And then also young people. We need to pay attention to young people, skilled people, and unskilled young people. So when we look at family, the function of family has become again very important, because in many of the modern societies, the function of family decreased. I mean, in the sense that school is the primary education agency, and then school starting from the kindergarten, and also family lost its importance as an economic unit, because in many of the modern and social state countries, the state take care of people. But now what is happening, family as a unit, as an economic unit, is becoming more important. And also now many families, they are giving a lot of time to their children's education. Children are having online education, but they need their parents' support. And when we look at the urban, from urban to country return, this is one of the expectations of the sociologists. What happened within the last 20 years, the cities became overcrowded. People start living in a very small flat, overcrowded, and then they spend a lot of time in traffic, and many urban poor are working in informal sector. And now this employment is going to hit the service sector and also many unskilled workers. So what we expect is return to country and then more pastoral life.
Right.
Here, the key point is whether there will be a very serious food crisis. Again, a food crisis is expected, but if economic problem doubled with the food crisis, then, pastoral life will be a very dominant way of life for the majority of people. Maybe it will be more in the underdeveloped countries, even in the U.S. For example, in New York City, people are planning to move to suburbs because they can work online.
Ms. Narli,
they don't need to come to city. Yes.
Right. I'm sorry to interject there, but you mentioned the displacement that this will cause, and we're already seeing many migrant workers across the world within their own countries' territories being displaced, not having any place to go because of the lockdown. We're going to see that exacerbated. What does displacement do to society at large? How does it impact various social aspects, routines, and also how does it impact the crime rates? How does it impact various aspects that we don't really account for in daily lives?
All right. So when we look at, seasonal workers, I will give an example from Turkey. Georgians and then Afghani people came to the Black Sea region, North Black Sea region, for tea harvesting, but now they cannot come. And also other Turkish seasonal workers, they cannot move there. So what's happening, the unemployed young men who have a university degree, they could be be working in tea harvesting. So now they cannot work. They are unemployed. We can see university graduates working in agriculture. This is one of the possibilities. And social anxiety is increasing worldwide. And then, risk society has become part of our daily life routine. But what is going to happen, definitely, this online working will be a norm, and digitalization, what we see is acceleration of history. Digitalization already started, now digitalization is accelerated. People prefer flexible working hours, now it is also accelerating. This pattern is becoming a norm. So They are the changes I expect.
Right, Ms. Narli.
Predict, and like,
Right.
Yes.
You as a sociologist, as you mentioned, there's an increase in digitalization. We also know there's an increase in surveillance precisely for the need to trace, track, and treat individuals during this outbreak. You as a sociologist, what concerns does that raise within you?
Okay, this is, big data observing us. In the past, we talk about Big Brother watching us, but now big data is watching us, and this is, again, one of the important pattern, and then it is accelerating, and now also our health and bodies will be under the big data control, because now our bodies and health issues, it is not a private issue anymore, it is a public health issue. So it's again a social policy issue. This will be one of the important change, and the states, they want to have more medical information, and then this will increase the big data watching us trend.
Right. What do you see those impacts on people's psyche, on how we operate? This is unprecedented, the level of surveillance and the level of acceptance to the fact that that's needed right now during this point in time. How do you see that impacting, especially when we take a look at past events, for instance, 9/11, when there was a spike in surveillance? How did that cause changes within society? And what is expected, extrapolating from that onto the future? What is expected to happen now?
This is a question of new normal. And of course, many people are very worried about this big data watching people. And some people are even not aware of it. Okay, some people are aware of it and they try to take measures to protect themselves. But now people, they love social media, and then they use social media intensively and extensively, and they leave digital traces. So these digital traces are, good source of data for the companies and for the states. And so maybe this will be the new normal, but I know that it creates a lot of anxiety. And then people feel that their privacy is violated. And again, another source of anxiety. We need to talk to maybe psychologists, how it affects people. When you feel that you are under surveillance and then you are being watched all the time, it is, of course, very disturbing. But when it is a security and then public health issue, and then people say, okay, I accept this, but in return, I want the government to protect me, to provide me food, to provide me social services. So it's a type of social contract agreement.
Right.
But this social contract is going through a transformation, and then we will see how it is going to be transformed in the coming days.
Right. Thank you so much, Ms. Nilufer Narli, for joining us, taking out the time to us. I think the key takeaway from that is that we are in the middle of a transformation. Where it's headed exactly, no one knows precisely, but we will be seeing rapid changes as they are unfolding right during this time as well. Now we're joined by Professor Steve Keane, who's a professor of economics, distinguished research fellow at University College of London, and author of Debunking Economics. He joins us from Thailand. Thank you so much, Professor Keane, for joining us, and I love the background you have there behind you. Professor Steve Keane, now when we talk about unemployment rates increasing all across the world and we see what's happening right now, is it going to get much, much worse before it gets better?
Yes, it will. We're only seeing the very direct impacts in some ways in the first 3 or 4 weeks of lockdown in America, for example. And the increase in unemployment in that 4 weeks was an additional 33 million people. Now, even that's underreported because the recorded number of increase in unemployment in the 14% rate of unemployment reported just a couple of days ago was about 22 million. They therefore counted about 10 million people as no longer in the workforce. Which is the sort of distortion that's actually built into the unemployment statistics. But of course, we're going to see the flow-through effects now. They may be attenuated by, in particular the case of America, the, I think, very premature decision to reopen commerce. But my feeling is we're going to see unemployment go from the recorded 14% to probably recorded 20% and a real-world level of about 30% for the United States.
Right, and this seems to be a thing that is not just unique to the United States. In India, there's almost 120 million workers out of work. In Pakistan, it's estimated that we're going to have 18 million job losses. And these are just all the ones that are recorded in the formal economy. Now, to try to absorb this information and try to break it down and understand the implications of lives in the future, about how our society will operate in the future, it seems like an enormous task. But help take us through it. What are some of the worst case scenarios that are feared to happen, especially with these losses in jobs?
Well, one of the big tragedies, particularly in the OECD nations, more so than in developed economies, is the level of private debt is the highest in the history of Western capitalism. And with those high levels of debt, most workers only have enough money in their bank accounts to pay that month's mortgage or that month's rent. So if they're in lockdown for more than a month, unless the government generates a cash flow for them, which governments are doing reluctantly and not as much as they should do, unless that's still generated for them, they'll run out of money in a month. And then that basically means starvation. Now, this, of course, is unheard of in OECD nations since the Great Depression, and it may lead to quite severe social backlash. In that sense, you can understand people demanding the economy be reopened, even though they're standing around in large protests, basically setting themselves up to catch the virus and then, be unable to work and potentially die.
Right. Professor Steve Keane, it seems like all across the world, this discussion has been divided into whether we need to remove the lockdown in order to save the economy or to keep it there in order to save lives and to prevent such a huge loss to the health infrastructure. But talking about how do we get to that point of opening the economy, but also trying to make sure that lives are protected, there seems to be a huge gap in that conversation. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do, with an enormous gap. I mean, one of my colleagues, a man called Benir Yarbam, is the world's leader on pandemic control and also works in what's called complexity science. He has a website called endcoronavirus.org. And in that, he's been arguing for months now that we could actually eliminate the virus with a 5-week lockdown, completely eliminate it, wipe it off the face of the planet. And what it requires is everybody to be isolated for that length of time, except those who are providing essential services, which really comes down to food, sanitation, power, internet these days, and management of the government response. And then with that 5-week period, it could be gone. Now, instead, what we're getting is a half-hearted mishmash of the two. Some countries like Taiwan in particular, also New Zealand, have done a very effective lockdown, look like they're going to eliminate the virus completely. But other countries like America have floundered, and so has the UK. They're going to go through a period of enormous economic pain and still have the virus with them when they start reopening. So it's a sign that we cannot manage this using our standard market-oriented ideological approaches. We have to get the state in control, do it for 5 weeks, and then eliminate the virus. Well, we haven't done it for most of the world.
Right. Professor Steve Keane, please stay with me. I'm going to come back to you and we're going to talk in greater detail about everything you've mentioned here. But before that, I'd like to talk to another guest who's just joined us, Ms. Sehadat Ikram, who's a neuropsychologist joining us from Istanbul. Thank you so much, Ms. Ikram, for joining us and welcome to the show. Now, as we've been talking about the looming financial crisis, one that has already caused such devastation across the world due to a consequence of the outbreak, what do you fear happening on the collective mental health of nations across the world?
So when we look at the psychology of the community, of the individual as well, we try to understand basic needs of the people. So the basic needs of the people is security. So when we talk about the coronavirus, the one of the major impacts of security is, income. So people want to go to work, to earn money, to gain money, and to find the food for their family. But no one is the current problem. Maybe one of the worst situation right now is psychology, because what we are seeing, we got too many telephones from all around the world, not even in Turkey, all around the world. People keep asking how can their psychology become better. So one of the worst things I just really wanted to mention, the people who had coronavirus. And we talk some people who had the coronavirus, and we know some people, their parents or their relatives, they know them. They said, our mother or father believe that they're gonna die. They felt it, or they know that they're gonna die. And some people, they said, no, I don't want to die. I just want to fight with coronavirus. So even your psychology affecting your immune system, and those also affecting your, the cells to fight against the coronavirus. So in that part, the psychology is really important. As you know, that the other point is isolation. People are isolated all around the world. So we are human beings. We are social beings. We want to talk to people. We want to see the people. But current time, it's also impossible. When we are talking to people, we also talk to the children as well. So children, they became more aggressive. The uncertainty makes them more fearful because they want to see their friends. They don't know, are they going to go to school, or can they see their friends as well? So those are really important for the children as well. Yeah.
Right. Ms. Ekman, as you mentioned here, the fear that is gripping all of us, and especially those who have families on the front lines, those who have already been suffering from this disease or are immunocompromised. Their fears, their anxiety is amplified tenfold there. Now, you as a professional who's dealing with this, what would your advice be to those people? How can they cope during these times?
Okay, that's a great question, because we are just keep talking people about this issue. One is, please don't watch too many news, okay? Don't watch too many news about coronavirus, because your brain is manipulating people and keep saying, oh, am I gonna die? Am I gonna have having a coronavirus and those kind of things? And second one, please write a letter for your future. Yeah, plan it, like 5 years, 10 years later. What do you want to be? What do you want to do? What's your dream about future? Please write it down, or make a list. As you know, it's kind of a to-do list. And the last one, I can suggest, just pick the phone and call someone, or call your relatives and just tell them that how much you love them. Just share your love, share your emotions. Because, of course, not only, everyone has a fear, of course. So, but the good thing is we need to share our emotions.
Right.
We need to share our feelings. Of course, we know that we all have a fear. We have an anxiety.
Right,
of
but
course,
it's important.
There's an uncertainty, because no one knows that it's going to be finished soon or later. We don't know.
Ms. Sehadat Ekman, thank you so much for joining us and talking to us about that. That's an important message to send out, that this is the time with so much uncertainty around, that we need to resign to those emotions and try to express what we're feeling and not try to bottle it in. Professor Steve Keane, moving back to you and talking to you about something that where we left off before, in which you talked about we cannot operate as we traditionally do in our capitalist models. Do you see this as an opportunity to move towards sustainable development once economies reopen, or do you feel like it's far removed from that possibility?
It's certainly a possibility we can move that way. The trouble is the people who are in power right now, and I'm thinking particularly of fossil fuel companies and the financial sector, are going to try to reimpose their dominance after we go through this. In Australia, for example, the government, even though it's done a very good job on suppressing the virus, has started abolishing controls on pollution of mining ventures. The same thing has happened in America. But if you look at what's actually happening right now, the UK is functioning completely without fossil fuel.
Right.
All the energy the United Kingdom is currently using is solar and wind generated. So it does give us a possibility, if we cut back to essential consumption and very little additional, we can cover it all with renewable energy. And that should be the direction we try to move the globe in.
Right. And Professor Keane, as you say that, it's frustrating to hear, as you cite the example of the Australian government, how come economies bouncing back from this are moving towards models that are actually promoting the same things we were supposed to move against in the coming years? Because I don't think in the future economies will be able to withstand more pandemics, more frequent pandemics, if we continue on the course that we have been doing so in terms of development.
I agree entirely. I mean, this is the first real global warning shot of the climate against the damage we've done by ignoring the warnings of the limits to growth 50 years ago and increasing the load we put on the planet literally by a factor of 4, both in terms of doubling population and doubling energy consumption per head over that time. We're making it impossible for the biosphere to cope with this. It therefore is starting to break down, and this breakdown is the very first of many we're going to experience unless we dramatically reverse direction. Now, my fear is we will continue going this way even after the warning shot of the coronavirus. But if there's any chance to change direction, it's now.
Professor Steve Keane, just one question that I want to ask before we end this. Do you feel like if we do move towards a more sustainable model, we can somehow better protect the individuals that will be impacted by the job losses we've seen? Do you see that as a possibility, especially when we talk about greater employment opportunities?
Certainly, I'd see in terms of the universal basic incomes, because one thing which has been done, which people said was impossible beforehand, has happened in many countries around the world, and that's people have been given a cash handout directly from the government. Then that was said to be impossible. Well, it's being done immediately. That then makes a precedent for a universal basic income in the future, and that can reduce the pressure on people to think they have to go and work at meaningless jobs. It's a way of potentially learning something from this crisis, and in the process of it restricting the damage we do to the planet. My fear is that we will, having got through this, we'll go back to the same old mistaken beliefs. We'll have governments imposing austerity to save money rather than physical austerity to save the planet. And that's what we really need.
Right. And I'm going to end our segment on that very point, that the physical austerity which is needed to save our planet, that is such an important point there. Thank you so much, Professor Steve Keane, for joining us, taking out the time to talk to us. We're going to go for a short break, but when we return, we talk about the future of public transportation across Europe. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. As Europe plans to begin reopening, a huge question mark is put on how individuals will commute in busy cities. For many countries, bicycle seems to be the top choice. But let's take a deeper look at some of the changes that will be brought to public transportation and the way people get around. Joining us for this conversation is Mr. David Rudlin, is principal and a director of Urbanism, Environment and Design, chair of the Academy of Urbanism, and an honorary professor at Manchester University. He joins us from Manchester. Also joining us today is Mr. Daniel Conley, who's a cities researcher and a consultant based in Adelaide. He also works with the University of Adelaide on research regarding public transportation. He joins us from Perth. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Rutland, let me begin with you now, talking to you from the heart of Europe, what's exactly happening all around you. Recently, a huge amount of money was announced for public transportation, and especially talking about how bicycles will intervene in all of this. Can you take us through what are some of the ways governments, and especially the UK government, feels they're going to approach this matter?
Well, I'm not sure the UK government is particularly approaching this matter. We had an announcement on Sunday about the slight easing of our lockdown, and part of that said, please go to work by car if you can, rather than by bike or public transport, which is very disappointing for many people. I mean, I've been cycling around in my daily exercise in Manchester, and it's wonderful to have the streets so clear of traffic and the air so clear of pollution, and a lot of people don't want to go back. So there's discussions about transferring roadway into cycleways and so on. That's happening in Manchester, it's happening in London and elsewhere. But as for national policy, we don't see it yet.
Right, and talking about that there is no national policy yet, what do you think is the backlog on that matter? Is it just because there's so much unpredictability and there's no way of moving forward?
I think it's a sense, and our government is very much in catch-up mode because they've been slow throughout this pandemic. I think there's also real concerns about public transport. In the larger cities, people have been told to go back to work if they can't work from home, but they've also been told to avoid public transport. Now, obviously, if they can, cycling and walking is great, but in the larger cities, that's actually quite difficult. So I think we're going to get a huge increase in traffic as the lockdown starts to ease, because people are being told to use their cars, which, as I say, is disappointing.
Right. Now, Mr. Rutland, just a question to you before I jump back to Mr. Conley and bring him into this conversation as well. Now, all across the world, we are watching Europe closely as they try to place some measures to reopen. That's why what's happening there is of interest to the entire world. Now, when we talk about the fact that this very thing that people are being told to move back and start working, not just from home, but they're also being told to avoid public transportation. What kind of situation does that bring up? And what is the cost of that when people can't use public transportation?
Transportation is still going. I mean, there is like a smaller service on public transportation, so it's available if you have no alternative. But the advice, as I say, to avoid it. I think the government is very concerned about the economic damage being done to the economy by the lockdown. And as I say, on Sunday, the advice was for people who can't work from home, and many of us, of course, can work from home, but those of us who can't should go back to work. And so I think it's going to be difficult. I think Germany and certain other countries are already seeing a slight increase in cases as a result of the lockdown being eased. In Britain, we've had, if we're honest, quite a lax lockdown. There's been quite a lot of people out in the streets and so on. I think we're going to find it much more difficult to lift because our daily cases have not really come down as greatly as other parts of Europe. So we're in a difficult position here in Britain because we need to get the economy moving again, but we haven't really got to grips with the pandemic yet.
Right, and that is a dilemma that resonates with many countries all across the world during this time. Mr. Daniel Conley, now you're talking to us from Perth, a country in which cases seem to have been controlled. The outbreak has been controlled, at least for now. Now, when talking about reopening the economy, imagining the way forward in Australia at this point in time, is there this understanding that the way of life, and especially when we talk about public transportation and the mode of commute, will be changed forever?
Thank you. So I'm joining from Australia, and I'm actually in Adelaide, which is very close by to Perth in Australia. I think the first thing to say there is that, you know, transport decisions are everyday decisions that people make. And I think, you know, first and foremost, what this lockdown and this pandemic situation has done is it's forced people, or it's given people the opportunity to rethink those everyday decisions. You know, do I have the opportunity to spend more time at home? You know, maybe it's only 1 or 2 days a week where I can work from home rather than needing to go into the city. Some people are privileged enough to have that decision, and others don't have that choice. But, you know, people are thinking through things like that. People are thinking through whether or not they place more value on being out in the fresh air and experiencing face-to-face interaction with other people or adding value to local places. So I think, when we think about a transport system as a combination of all those individual transport choices, I think there's definitely going to be potential changes in how we move out the other side of this. Having said that, comparing Adelaide, where I live, to some of the cities that we see in Europe who are taking measures to provide, cycling infrastructure, more walking infrastructure, I haven't seen that level of shift in thinking here in Australia. Without a doubt, I think that public transport has been hit hard here, as it has been hit hard in basically every city around the world. So I do think that, in order to avoid everyone jumping in their car and driving into city centres, we really do need to follow the lead of some of the European cities and cities in South America as well that have really chosen to be proactive about coming out the other end of this situation, right? With different transport choices.
Right. Mr. Conley, earlier I was talking to a guest about the fact that this pandemic in many ways has caused us to rethink our models, economic models, and the models on which our societies are premised on. Now, talking about a more sustainable way forward and how this might change our conception of how cities are designed and planned on that deeper level, not just on individual choices. Do you think that there will be a change?
I think there's an opportunity to change. So there's sort of two sides to this argument. So one side is that people, as a result of this COVID-19 pandemic, might be more reluctant to spend time, maybe just initially, in really crowded, dense public spaces, and might opt for more space where they can have space for themselves and they feel safer. When it comes to transport and city planning, there's two ends of the spectrum. So there's a path that follows growth built around cars and private automobiles, and generally that growth is very low density and spread out, and that's mostly what we've got in Australia. The other end of the spectrum is to more focus around density and public transport and get all of the economic agglomeration, social benefits that come out of that. Now, I think on the one hand, while people might be initially reluctant to spend time in densely populated spaces, on the other hand, cities are really looking to boost their economies out of the other end of this pandemic. And I think if we try and, for example, stimulate the economy with investment in infrastructure that's just focused around more cars, we don't get the sort of economic benefits that we can achieve if we focus on more sustainable infrastructure that creates long-term growth opportunities, such as public transport, rail.
Right, got you. I want to jump to Mr. David Rudlin and talk to him about this similar point. Mr. Rudlin, now, we don't know when a vaccine is going to come out. There are also many experts coming out and saying that people should brace themselves that there might not be a vaccine at all, and we're going to have to adjust to the reality somehow. Now, in this new world, in this new normal, as many people are calling it, do you think it will impact how cities are designed in the long term?
I think it could do. I think there are lots of people saying that cities will become, as Daniel said, more less dense, more spread out. So we're not sort of quite so cheek by jowl by people. I was writing the other day an article, and people said that after 9/11 in New York, they said that who would come back and live in New York or have offices in New York when it was such a target, and people's memories were actually very short. And within a few months, people were living and working in New York in the same way as they had been. And I think that will be true also of the pandemic. People will be reluctant, I think, initially to come back, to go to a restaurant, to a theatre, to go onto a busy public transport route. But I think within a few years, the benefits of cities are so great to our economy, the benefits to people's own livelihoods are such that I think cities will come back. Let's hope we have a vaccine, because otherwise we're going to be living with this uncertainty for a long time, and it will have a huge impact on our economy. But I hope we will have a vaccine. I think the work is promising in that respect.
No, definitely that. Of course, the hopes and prayers of people all across the world that we see an end to what we're seeing right now, this pandemic, this crisis that has ravaged across the world. Mr. David Rutland, but it seems like during this time there has been this greater understanding or perspective of how much damage humans and their actions have caused to the environment. We've been seeing appreciation by people all across the world, just seeing it in a new light. Talking about that, do you think coming forth from this, we're going to actively try to hit those targets in how we move about in a sustainable manner, especially since we have for so long put that on the back burner and just tried to move business as usual?
Love to think so. I would very much hope that that is the case, that we take this chance with all sorts of things, the way that we're working much better as communities, the way that we have much less cars on the road, much less pollution. Our CO2 emissions are much, much lower than they were previously. If we could capture all that and bring our economy back and keep those gains, that would be great. I think historically, the conclusion is that we probably will not do that unless we really work at it. I was talking to someone the other day who was in the Design Council in London, and they were saying how that was set up during the war, not after the war, but in the middle of the war, to try and improve standards of design after the war. This is the time to plan for those things, and I very much hope that we will do that.
Right, and I'm going to come back to you and tell you a little about what you think are some of the things that need to be planned for and some of the changes that you feel like are important. But I want to go back to Mr. Daniel Conley and put this last question to him. Mr. Conley, as Australia opens up and as the lockdown eases in some way or form, is public transportation up and running? And if it is, what are some of the measures being taken in order to protect those who are using it?
Great question. So yeah, public transport will still be available in Adelaide, and I think and in Australia, our government's taken a number of measures to try and facilitate a greater level of safety in the community, with things like digital apps that are able to identify if you've been in proximity with someone that later tests positive to coronavirus, for example. So there are some digital tools, emerging technologies that are being used as well as obviously higher levels of cleanliness and cleaning that's happening. So yeah, I think public transport will still have a role to play. However, I do think it's going to be a tough road, at least initially, and I do think that things like experimenting with new active travel, cycling and walking really needs to complement the public transport for this foreseeable future in order to avoid massive congestion and everyone on the road in cars.
Right. Thank you so much, Daniel Conley, for joining us and talking to us about this. Mr. Rudlin, back to you and talking to you about that point I wanted to bring up again, which is during this time, what type of planning is needed for the future in terms of how we understand how we're going to develop in the future? As you were mentioning that the time is now, there is an opportunity. What do you think is important to keep in mind and prioritize?
Well, I think the first priority is, of course, climate change. In the UK, a lot of cities are looking to go zero carbon, and there were plans before this pandemic to do that over the next 10 years. That's obviously crucial. However, what's also really important, and actually your viewers will be aware that the big issue in the UK before the pandemic was Brexit and our exit from the European Union. And that is really about a deep down divisions within our cities. We have a huge group of people who feel left behind, who feel left out of economic growth. And I think there's a huge amount of sympathy for service workers and people like that as part of the pandemic. And that is one of the things that we need to really address about the inequities in our cities and the huge divides of wealth and that exist. So that's also crucial. As a planner, I also want to see us becoming much better at the design of our cities, the creation of humane public spaces, the places, convivial spaces, places where activity takes place, which I think you're probably much better than we are. But in the UK, it's something we've been very bad at. And again, that's something we're working to plan to try and improve with the new cities that we'll get after pandemic.
Right, Mr. Rutland, just one last question to you very quickly. And I know this is a very complicated question, but you mentioned this, how we need to identify the inequities, the inequalities that exist across our systems. Can better city planning help to mitigate those?
As a city planner, I would hope that they could. I think the inequities, in a sense, have been due in part to the success of cities. So what's happened in the UK and across a lot of Europe is that some of the larger cities have done quite well. People working in good jobs in those cities have done very well. People in the smallest cities and the smaller towns have done quite badly and felt left behind. And so something about transportation, something about spreading the wealth out from the cities to the other places is very important. And something about looking at things like housing. Housing is a big divide, and people in lockdown have certainly felt that if you're in a tiny flat or a shared flat, then lockdown is terrible, whereas if you're in a large house, obviously it's a lot easier. And those divisions of wealth and housing opportunity have really been made starkly aware by the pandemic.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. David Rudlin, for talking to us, taking out the time to talk to us. Also joining us now is Mr. Valerio Bordernaro, who's an analyst joining us from Rome. Thank you so much, Valerio, for joining us, and welcome to the show. Now, talking about how Italy, one of the worst hit places in the entire world, is now thinking about recovery, thinking about reopening the economy. How much of a point of conversation is commute and public transportation in this entire decision-making and in this entire discussion of how to reopen?
Well, thank you. This is a very big issue. So we count that before the COVID outbreak, in Italy every day there used to be 100 million commuting. That means an enormous number of people moving back and forth to go working, school, universities. Nowadays, our mantra is social distancing. That means that what we were used to experience during the peak hours, meaning full buses, full underground, that's no longer possible, at least for the time being. So Italy is trying to reopening gradually, keeping those public transportation as empty as possible. So we're talking about trying to keep 50% of the maximum capacity of public transportation, but at the same time, of course, we have the need to take under control car traffic. What is happening in these days is that in public transportation we are obliged to keep the distances and to sit every other chair of the bus or the underground. But what's new is that the government will give a special bonus for buying electric bikes and those kind of mono-seat transportation medium.
There's a greater incentive there to try to move towards those types of modes of commute. I got that there. Mr. Bordernaro, but as you mentioned that there are policies that want to be implemented in order to prevent another outbreak, how are they being regulated and implemented? Because that seems to be the essential issue. We know that before the lockdown, we saw public reactions in which there wasn't great consideration of the implications of the outbreak, and that's why it got as bad as it did. Now, when economies are reopening, how are all these policies being regulated and implemented?
Well, I think it's going to be a little bit chaotic in the first month, but thanks God, schools are not reopening, and this means that students will not move, and that's a big part of the people moving every day back and forth to go to their work or universities or schools. What we're going to see is that Italy is trying to avoid as much as we can peak hours. This means that the frequency of the buses or the public transportation will be incremented, and on the same time, we're trying to promote private transportation. Of course, private transportation has its, a back part that is traffic. So we're trying to avoid this traffic congestion by, of course, incentives for sustainable mobility. And I told you again, it's about 500 euros. That means $500 that the government is giving to everyone to buy bicycles, to make it simple. On the same time, the frequency of the buses will be implemented more and more to avoid these peak hours. But of course, till school are not reopening, situation could be under control.
Right.
When students will start flowing again, it's going to be a little bit more complicated.
Right. It's, of course, an uphill task for any country at this point in time to even think about reopening and then moving towards reopening, moving towards a smart lockdown, or moving towards trying to understand how to give guidelines to their individuals. But it requires great caution because the need of the hour is to make sure that there isn't another outbreak, that countries that are on the path of recovery do not see spike in cases again. Thank you so much, Mr. Valerio Bordernaro, for joining us from Rome. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.